Welcome to The Mystic Lens, a podcast by Current Collective Church where we explore the spiritual path through stories of transformation from real people in our community and explorations of Christian tradition through a mystic perspective. Our hope is that these conversations will help us feel even more connected to God, ourselves, and each other, inspiring us to live more expansively from the well of living water within. To learn more or connect with us further, visit thisiscurrent.org.
Thanks for joining me on this episode of The Mystic Lens, Tim.
Yeah, no problem. Excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, man. You know, I was looking through some old emails because I was looking for the email to send you this link.
Yeah.
And I ran across our initial email exchange from, I think it was like 2018.
18 or something, right? Yeah.
Yeah. And I was like doing... You know, it was an interesting period of time, but I was reading back through our interactions, you know, and I'm just like, hey, I've been following Way Collective and things like that, and would love to catch up with you. And then we ended up coming up to see you guys and dropped in for a dinner and dialogue.
I remember.
And yeah, that was a really, really meaningful time and really helped make some decisions in that season. So I always appreciate you for that, man.
Oh, it's beautiful. And you had just moved out here, right?
Yeah, we'd been out here for only a couple of years at that point.
Yeah,
so
yeah, that's cool.
Yeah, man. So connected with you through Way Collective, and so you know, like I was chatting with you about, like the point of this podcast initially was as we've been gathering together as Current Collective. There's a lot of incredible stories and people that come through the space that I feel like I want to highlight. And so I've been just having conversations with people. So, you know, when people show up on Sunday or we do other gatherings, people already have a little insight into each other's background stories and hopefully develop some trust quicker with each other to drop in. And with that, though, I was like, I want to bring on some of my friends that have been doing some of this stuff. And in large part, really, so people in our community can hear about others that are doing something similar, because as you know, there's not a whole lot of people in this sort of unique space of, you know, wanting to be in this contemplative path, the mystic, non-dual, whatever other, you know, YouTube buzzwords you want to throw into the search engine.
Right.
You know, there's not a lot of people that have communities around those sort of things. And you're one of those people, leaders. And so want people just to kind of get your perspective and background. And yeah, that's kind of the playground we're working with today, dude.
Love it. Looking forward to it.
All right. Well, let's just jump into some of your background and story so people can get to know you a little bit more. Where'd you grow up? And I know some of these things, but some other people don't. And let the cat out of the bag, fellow PK, right? So what was some of your worldview, your foundation, you know, in terms of, like, Richard Rohr uses the language of, like, you know, you got to build something first before you start to take it apart and see. Like, what was your foundation and structure growing up?
Well, I had a firm foundation, Luke. You know, I grew up actually just north of you all in San Clemente, so not far away from Current. And I grew up in the house of a Calvary Chapel pastor. So my worldview was, I mean, I say, like, from birth to breathe was to be Christian. It was the only story I was given, you know, about the world. And, you know, like Peter Berger, sociologist, talks about, we all are kind of given a sacred canopy that covers our lives, you know, whether it's a religious or secularized form of that. But for me, it was definitely just Bible believing Christianity. That was my worldview, you know. And so growing up in that house, you know, Sunday school and bedtime stories and just, you know, that was my life. And so, yeah, that's where I, you know, grew up for probably the first 18 to 20 years of my life, you know, was kind of in that vein, and went to, and eventually ended up going to an Assemblies of God college to play basketball. So I had a little Pentecostal sprinkled in there. You know, I then worked in a Presbyterian church for about 9 years. So, you know, had the good frozen chosen folks there for a bit. Man. And, you know, now I kind of work with a really much more open denomination. But But for me, yeah, definitely the Christ lens was the lens through which I've seen the world in. And, I kind of call myself a theological mutt because of those diverse expressions of Christianity that I've been a part of. But it's been beautiful just to kind of see the tapestry of a wider understanding of Christianity. And then kind of ultimately, I think you and I will probably get here at some point, just talking about the contemplative option as a future path for it. So,
yeah, man.
Yeah.
So when you're growing up, Calvary Chapel in San Clemente, what was this is just for me. What was the sort of take on the vineyard expression? A lot of people will lose some folks here for a second, but just stick with us.
No, it's all good.
But I'm curious, what was, because that was kind of a thing around here, was like Calvary Chapel, vineyard, and in Southern California had its own take on all that, right?
Right. My dad was pretty well connected, I think, in both of those movements since the 70s, and so it was always spoken of in a positive light in our community. I mean, I didn't have much experience with vineyard directly myself growing up, but again, it was my dad, I think, had friends who were in part of that movement and pastors in those churches, and so yeah, I mean, I know kind of historically the connection too between the Jesus People movement and when all that kind of got started, but yeah, no, I mean, generally a positive association, but again, I didn't have like much direct contact with those communities growing up.
Okay. Yeah, man, because that was always the thing of and it's such a funny thing, and we still do it in some ways, such small splitting hairs over the differences of those two movements. When you're in those two movements, you're like, oh, they're so different. But as soon as you step back, you're like, you guys are really, really similar, and so it's fun that we both have that background and
for sure,
and appreciative of it. Maybe you can share about some of this too. Even where I'm at today is you go through that time in deconstruction era and that has become such a buzzword, but I was in the midst of it whenever I first met you back in 2018. Right. And it was you start to really look down on those experiences or even those existing movements. And I think that's the natural kind of teenage. And if you're looking at maturity things, it's natural to do that. Right. But what's some of that now for you? How do you look back on your early childhood? What's the relationship like with your dad? How are some of those things?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely now can say that I look back upon it pretty fondly, honestly. Especially my childhood years. I think of Sunday school and singing songs that I still sing to my kids, and songs that are based on God's love and things like that. But generally, it was I was loved pretty well by people in that community, and again, larger ideological things aside that I didn't really know about at that age, people were genuinely pretty kind and loving, and I have good memories. I even led worship at that church during college for a little bit, in its kind of last few years of existence, But yeah, I think I went through that angsty time too, as I was sort of just kind of outgrowing those, ideological confines. And so my dad and I had some tough conversations along the way, and he would say the same thing, and I started to see the world very differently. I got really interested in, I would say philosophical theology and cosmology and things that just weren't a part of the conversation growing up that was so biblical revelation based, and so those things really were a gift to me at a certain point in my journey that helped me deconstruct some of those kind of older ideas and re-imbue them with kind of a new sense of openness and novelty, and so that was so that migration away from the old thing was hard for my dad and I especially. But we worked through it. It took some time. It took some honest conversations, and it took some boundary setting and just some kind of acknowledgement of our differences. But now we don't talk about it as much. I'll be honest, because we just don't want to. I don't want to activate him. I don't think he wants to activate me. And so we just sort of have a, I guess, an agreement now to we talk about certain things that we both enjoy, but but maybe don't broach the deeper parts of that theological landscape as much anymore. So,
dude, that's so similar to where I'm at, because my dad, he's just now retiring this year. He's 70. He's hanging it up, and but you used the language activate, and I think that's probably the best way I could have described it. When you go into some of these things, you get activated in a certain way. And, we keep things around motorcycles and, and I shared with somebody recently, I'm like, at the end of the day, like I don't need him to be my pastor or my theologian. I need him to be my dad. And he doesn't need me to be his stone throwing prophet, against all his stuff. I got to be his son, and so it's just a good little nugget there, I think, for people that are going through a sort of evolution of their worldview and trying to navigate that with people that they love, and
That's
so
well
it's
said.
man. Yeah. So when did things begin to take a shift for you in terms of you seem to be more prone towards the philosophical and looking at things a little more deeply. And how was that in your life?
Well, I've always been I think a creative and curious person. And I think those kinds of folks are more prone to when life kind of pokes and prods at you. And, for that to become an invitation to go somewhere new. And so for me, I was in seminary doing my Master's of Divinity, and I got diagnosed with cancer in 2010. And so in the midst of rethinking some big ideas and the kind of ideological, integration of new things, I had this existential moment of suffering and mortality and getting in touch with my finitude as a human being. And it kind of broke my world open, and so I really quickly started reading off the prescribed reading lists in seminary and trying to find other conversation partners who could engage some of the questions I was carrying. And for me, really early on, there were questions around what I would call divine action, right? Like, how does God actually move and act in the world? And is there anything we can say about God that actually correlates in any way with what we know about the world scientifically? And so you kind of mentioned the philosophical. I think for me, there became a point in my journey where kind of the rote answers and responses to those questions about God's nature just didn't really work for me anymore, given my experience of suffering and humanity. And so I got curious and I wanted to know, are there other ways that people think about divine reality? Are there other ways that metaphysicians and other people have parsed this thing out that give us different pictures of God, perhaps more, again, pictures of God or constructs of God that might correspond more accurately with what we continue to discover in quantum reality and cosmology. And so I got really interested in that stuff really quickly, which is where I found process theology. And so I did my doctorate in that eventually, but
so for those listening, what is process theology?
Well, process theology is, it's a brainchild of a philosopher named Alfred North Whitehead, who was a Harvard mathematician and metaphysician, and created a metaphysical scheme that really was based on what we call events rather than substances. So materialism and physicalism would be ways to look at the universe from a perspective of, hard matter, right? The smallest bits of reality are actually material substances. And Whitehead said, well, I mean, this is at the advent sort of discovering, again, quanta and different things. Like when you look a little bit more deeply at it, there's a sort of motiveness to reality. It's processual, it's moving. And so it's tough to try to build a metaphysical scaffolding from the hard bits of reality when everything's in motion. So he sort of saw the world from this place of, from the vantage point, I would say, of process. That's where that word comes from, essentially. And so that being said, there's a philosophical side to that, which I don't think we need to get into. I don't want to bore your listeners, but the theology side came about when he realized that to complete the metaphysical system, of there being an actual world that does have materiality in it, you have to have sort of a divine agent in the mix to make that happen. So he didn't set out to create a theological scheme, but God played a very specific role in his metaphysical, worldview. And so anyway, so you get this other picture of a God who's non-coercive. We sometimes say, like, that Tom Ord's another theologian that writes really some beautiful books in this field, but says that, God's love is uncontrolling. And what does it look like for God not to be necessarily an interventionalist God, kind of, breaking the natural order of things to do whatever God wants in certain instances where God feels like it, and other ones not, and what does it look like for God to be with us as kind of a, the fellow sufferer who understands compassionately our human situation and continues to lure us, again, non-coercively toward more beautiful, just, and loving ends in the world. So, I mean, again, this could be another 3 podcasts, that we to record on it, but that's, I guess, my really brief version of it. So,
dude, I think that's, and so this began to give you some real, it sounds like, some like, as maybe Rob Bell might say, boots on the ground with theology. It became less, and obviously correct me if I'm wrong on this, but from what I'm hearing is it became less about just like an idea game about how we interpret God working or not working, or even stories about why God heals some and doesn't heal other. And it was more about just like how we see divinity working in and through all of the things that are happening, whether they are, no matter what story we're telling ourselves about it, it's an embodied incarnation, really, if you get down into it, a more incarnational approach. So that began to shape you. And then during this time also, are you still, you have your sights set on like being in ministry for all intents and purposes? Like, are you still like processing this and going through the cancer and all of that with the intention of becoming a pastor or minister, or did that ever come into question with your changing worldviews?
Yeah, so I was already a college pastor at the time at that Presbyterian church. So I was already in ministry full time for quite a while before I got cancer. They were the ones who helped, put me through seminary, and so I was already in the midst of it, and I thought, I guess I've kind of felt like this since that event of cancer is, wow, if I could find a way to keep doing this work, I find it meaningful, then I would love to. And so, eventually I kind of got diffused from the Presbyterian system I was a part of because of my new kind of, transformed worldview, I guess. And part of that was social, right? Like my social conviction shifted to be open and affirming to queer and trans folks and things like that, which our church was kind of trying to go the other direction, even though it was in a denomination that had room for that. And so there's that kind of, I guess, that world opening there. So I kind of thought like, wow, if I can find a way to actually be myself and continue to kind of grow, continue to change, and keep doing this, that would be even more beautiful. And so I've kind of I feel lucky to have gotten in relationship again with another denomination after I left the Presbyterians that were, open and affirming. They're very socially just. They have very, very high emphasis on critical thinking, which when you have a lot of people who do graduate education, there's so much diversity of perspective that people have to figure out how to get along in the plurality of their views, And so it's fun to be in a larger group of people movement where there's so much diversity in that regard. And I feel lucky to even still be doing this work, to be honest, Luke. Like, I don't think Way Collective should really exist, but it does. I feel grateful,
So, okay, you are in the Presbyterian world when you are exploring the process theology. You're already in ministry. And then apparently you had this healing from cancer and how, like, I guess we should probably tap on a little bit of that part of the story. That seems like it would be significant, when did that, like, so how did, I guess, I don't know, how was the cancer story? We opened it up. I want to
Yeah, I think long story short, I'll try to again make it short. I got testicular cancer, which is, I was like early stage 2 when I caught it, and it's a younger man's disease. And I'll say the oncologist that I saw said, like, used to actually be a military oncologist, so a lot of young men, he would see this disease and said, here's the cocktail of chemotherapy we're going to give you. I've never seen it not work, right? So there was a pretty hopeful diagnosis there, even though the throes of chemo were inhumane, like the most hellish thing I've ever been through. But the reality was there's a pretty decent outlook, and then even, you can go on the forums online and kind of see people who got the same diagnosis as you who it didn't go well for, and you're like, oh, that's pretty crazy. And so yeah, through that process, it was, I had 4-week-long rounds of chemotherapy spanned out 2 or 3 weeks apart. And over 3 months, I think it was really the battle, and was cancer free, by April. So of that next year.
What a timely, way to be exploring process theology while you're in that, right? I mean, did that coincide at the same
That
time?
kind of came on the heels of it. So, like, again, I think this experience of suffering really, again, allowed me to begin to ask questions I wasn't asking before. And I was graced to have a professor at Fuller Theological Seminary who was an adjunct professor who was teaching the historical Jesus class. And he would say things in class that I would just be like, dude, this guy thinks some other things that he's not even able to say because he's at Fuller right now. And so what ended up happening is I would stay after class and just start asking him questions. And he, gracefully would end up staying with me for sometimes like an hour or two after class alone. And just like he would answer my questions and we would have dialogues about all this stuff. And he was my gateway drug to process theology. And ended up when I went to Claremont to do my doctoral work, he was by then had transitioned to be the head librarian out at Claremont School of Theology. So it was really funny, kind of the connection there. And then, during that time, I also found Homebrewed Christianity, which is another podcast, and Tripp is one of my best buds, and we connected, and I got proselytized, or proselytized, and the rest is history. So.
Yeah, man. Dude, the historical Jesus will mess people up pretty quick when they start getting down into that stuff. I always try to press into that with people because it's like, it's a much different story when you start looking at it through that lens, and no pun intended,
Well, it's funny because I remember one exercise in class, and Fuller's like pretty evangelical, but like full of different movements, right? Lutherans and Methodists and Presbyterians, and like you got clergy from all over in there, doing their master's work. And our teacher had us do a Jesus seminar exercise, which I don't know how familiar you are or with folks in your community are with that, which is essentially a group of scholars that got together with these die, like these cubes, and they would like look at every verse in every gospel and kind of say, yeah, this is the percentage I think Jesus may have actually said this or may have not said that. So in class one day, he had all of us, again, this group of clergy do this exercise, and people are looking around like, wait, what do you mean Jesus didn't say this? Like they think Jesus said everything in every gospel, and there's not really a question of that. So why would we ever sit here and just do this exercise saying like us seminarians think Jesus may or may not have actually historically said this? So it was kind of a, it was a pretty mind-boggling, I think, for a lot of people to have to open themselves to the kind of historicity conversation of the Gospels. And I mean, good on Tom for doing that and kind of leading us in that exercise. But I think for a lot of folks, it was really challenging because they didn't understand how the Bible just couldn't be literally true.
Right.
Yeah.
When is that when it began to change for you then?
Yeah, I mean, for sure. I mean, I remember the first day of class, he had a dual whiteboard, like 2 long whiteboards next to each other, and took a marker and said, like, here we are in, whatever year that was. I can't remember. It had to have been probably like 2011 or something, right? And he said he drew a line across both, whiteboards all the way down and said, and here's like where the Gospels were written like 2,000 years ago. And then he drew another line. He's like, and each of those were written 30 to 60 years after Jesus actually walked and lived. And then he said, like, and here's the dot where the historical Jesus was actually walking around. And he said, imagine how tough it is to actually get back to the original source here and see, and get to know that sort of Jewish Jesus walking around and speaking Aramaic in the first century. And it just kind of opened your eyes, like, wow, yeah, there's a lot of space here. Like, we've probably inherited a lot of things from our tradition, interpretively, I guess. And so he kind of started to just be playful in that way with it. And I had never really engaged, some of those historical Jesus scholars before that time. And so, yeah, it was really a gift, that kind of opened me up to another side of the conversation.
Dude, the Jesus seminar stuff is fascinating for sure.
Yeah.
I mean, I recommend people like listen to all those sorts of people like Bart Ehrman and all of that.
Sure.
Like, dude, I reference him even at our gatherings and stuff, whatever. I think it's important for people that have that sort of nerd bent, I guess. You know, some people are like, I don't give a shit about any of that. Just tell me something. But like, to me, I think it's really important, and especially as like, this obviously will be out after Easter, but this is Holy Week and we're leading up to Easter.
Right.
Maybe we can chat a little about like where you're at, and bring us up from where you're talking about, like, where are you thinking theologically, like even when it comes to a lot of this, like I said, like, and for our community, I say that people typically, I mean, it could be argued that we have as many unique doors as there are people, but everybody's got their own experience and story and stuff that has crafted, their worldview. But I would say by and large, there's typically two doors that people walk into our space. And, one is, for more of a spiritualist idea or a new age person that is interested in the teachings of Jesus. They've tried to maybe go to a church because they're like, if I want to learn more about Jesus, maybe I should go there. And it usually doesn't, happen for very long before they get ostracized or whatever, because they're like some weird Encinitas New Age people in their eyes. I like all those people. That's why they keep coming, because I'm one of them in some ways. But then the other door is like people who I call them like open-minded traditionalists, and I've never given credit to where I use that term from. And I guess it would be good in this conversation to give credit to my friend Jason Coker when I was with him for a brief time. He used that language. I have borrowed that. Hope he doesn't mind. But I use, because I see that in our space. There are people that have this very much Christian worldview and framework, but they're interested and open to some church like ours that does sound baths instead of worship music. I encourage people like Bart Ehrman to be in their reading lists and stuff like that. So they're open, from that. And so I guess, there's a lot of people that are interested, especially right now, in this figure of Jesus from a lot of different angles. And, I think that the contemplative path offers a really, or else I wouldn't be doing this, offers a really great approach, but, that comes with a lot of other caveats. So like, where do you think you would put your own worldview, your own, cosmology, even, whenever it comes to the work you do and where you're at and things like that?
Well, I mean, again, that's a pretty large question, like, I think, again, we could have a whole nother episode on that, but
and take as much time as you want, man.
I think for me, I'd say like my personal worldview is really at the intersection of like process cosmology and theology and kind of contemplative Christian teaching. So I think just as a kind of on the ground example, Jim Finley's, I think he's like 90% of what he says when he teaches is actually just good process theology, and he doesn't really know it because that's just not his lens, right? So when he says things like, if God stopped loving you into the present moment, you would disappear. What's he saying there, right? He's saying that on some level, the love of God is the ground of existence, right? It's the ground of our being on some level, or as we would say, kind of like the ground of our becomingness, And so I think for me, that kind of theologically tinged articulation of reality has been a real gift to me, and it's kind of been my sustaining, I think, spirituality and worldview for a long time. And I sometimes would say something like, and I wouldn't say this, all the time, because not everybody knows what these words mean, but that we are an intimation and instantiation of divine love. Like, that is what we are ontologically. That is the what of what we are. And if we see the world from that perspective, then, as Finley says, there's nothing missing anywhere, because they're at the heart of reality are these harmonious relations of love. And I sometimes say, I just had an essay released earlier, or at the end of last year, I guess, but early this year, that talks about love is the name of the universe. And why could we even say that? Like, how could we say that? Does that, again, correspond to anything actual about reality or not? Or is it just kind of like a poetic, kind of like ethereal notion because we like love, like, does that actually correspond to something real, And so for me, that kind of divine cycle of love that reality continues to be in seemingly endless revolutions is sort of a sustaining theopoetic description of the world for me that gives my life a ground. And so I kind of move this thing where it's like, there's a movement in my mind from like, love to beauty to peace. And love, I would say, again, is sort of the name of the tapestry of reality. Beauty is the product of the relationships of reality, which is, it's from everything from a subatomic particle to our lives to the universe to, you know what I mean? It goes from micro to macro. And that peace, as Whitehead says, is trusting in the efficacy of beauty. If you know things at a deep level are beautiful, then peace comes from that not knowing, and it's not head knowing. It's something I think we all intuit just as from our aliveness, you know what I mean? But it's for me, that flow from love to beauty to peace is really important in my own work, in my own life. So for me, that's a little window into my spirituality. I'm happy to explore anything you want more or move on.
Yeah. No, I think that's really good. Because even how you answered that, like, it was not with, references to particular verses or anything. It has to do with something very real and human, which is, when you fundamentally believe this beauty, peace is there. And these are all expressions of like the best parts of our human experience, and like, to me, like, I was talking to somebody recently, and actually I'll name him anyways too, because it's fun. But do you know Ryan Meeks? He was a pastor up in Seattle. He's from down here in San Diego.
I think I do know who that is, but I don't know him personally. Yeah.
He was early, like, mega church open and affirming pastor who eventually left. And, we become friends because he was down here in Encinitas and whatever. And, he responded back to something I posted on Instagram or whatever. And we were having this really great conversation. And bottom line is, we were talking about, like, how do you essentially gauge things, like if they are like healthy or not. And, and I was talking about, I referenced Paul. I'm like, I know this might be whatever for you, man, but like, I come back to the fruit of the Spirit. Like, I think there was something, Paul said a lot of great, brilliant things. Taking a break from him for almost a decade has really helped me re-engage that work. Yeah. But like, and some things were pretty, well, we'll just leave them there. But I think like what you mentioned is peace, beauty, like even the fruit of Spirit, love, peace, patience, joy. Like, that's, to me, the aim of the Christian expression and experience is actual embodied real things. You are the product, not your ideas about reality that you got everything squared away theologically now. So somehow you're okay. It's that you're like, my mom once asked me, are you still a Christian? And I said, like, do you think I'm like in your perspective, do you feel like I'm a good husband to my wife?
Yeah.
Do you think I'm a good dad? You know, like when you come to visit from Indiana, like how do you see my relationship with my neighbors? Like just some very simple things. And I left it at that because I feel like my question to you, the way you answered is kind of how I answered her, is like peace and beauty and love and all of these things should be the evidence of our faith.
Right.
And so, you know, I just think that what I love what you do, it's always bringing it back to that. And I think communities that operate around the way of Christ, I think are hopefully moving more in that direction, less, you know, belief statements and even value statements, but more of like beingness is all we need to show, you know? But you in that, to dovetail with that, and a little tangent there for myself, I admit, but you enter into this denomination that does have a focus on justice and does have an emphasis on, you know, real change in the world. But then I've noticed you have pressed more into the contemplative, and even like, I noticed you're even using the language of non-dual and some of like, I get your emails and, you know, see the posts and stuff. And to me, it's sometimes those camps have a really hard time understanding each other, or even working together. Ironically, sometimes they, you know, do well, but oftentimes it's because it's such an inner world thing on the one hand, and then an outer world thing. I think they work hand in hand well, but how are you merging together this very, you know, outward social, you know, movement emphasis with this non-dual contemplative life? That, like, how is that? It seems like that's showing up for you in your personal life, and therefore it's manifesting itself in the church life. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, we're learning all the time, I think, in our community, and I'm learning as a leader, like what it looks like to encourage folks to act justly in the world, you know, because it's a divisive time we're enduring right now, and fragmentation is sort of the norm in our society, and polarization, we're being forced to choose between what I would call, you know, in more contemplative language, dualisms everywhere, right? Left and right, you know, Republican, Democrat, progressive, traditionalist, like these are the growing poles of our society, and non-duality is I don't want to say combatant to that, but you know, non-duality is, I would say, drives a spoke in the wheel of that polarization in a way that really not only calls us to theoretically see things from a place of interconnectedness and acknowledge our underlying oneness, but it also sort of has this tinge to it in which if you really start to experience the world that way, you know, like Cynthia Bourgeault talks about how, you know, what happens is our perceptive field actually shifts in meditation from experiencing in separation to experiencing from a place of connectedness. And if you start to do that, then that other who's on the other side of the aisle from you politically, or sees your own even home religious tradition quite differently from you, is not really an other. They're a part of you. And so if you start to see from interconnectedness, then I think the pedagogy of how we live and move in the world in more just ways starts to show itself, because you can't anymore believe the narrative of separation, that we're actually separate. You know, and so then the actions come from that place. And, you know, in my program at Claremont, one of the heads of the program, Frank Rogers, has this strategy which he calls compassion-based activism. So I think a lot of what we see on the left right now is combatant activism, which is because things are so bad, we have to react and fight for what's right. But what ends up happening a lot of times is, if it's with the same energy of those people over there are the bad ones and we're the good ones, it only ends up further fragmenting things. Right. And instead, this wheel of compassion-based activism calls us to see the hurt and the cry in a difficult other, right? That person who's on the opposite side from you is not just, you know, the person who's wrong, the person who's bad. They're a person who has a deep wounding. And so the activism has to come from this connective place of, can I, and this is his language, again, Frank's language, can I have firm limits around violation? Because violence is an affront to the moral fabric of our society. And in that limit, that boundary that I set, that I will not stand for violence, can I connect with another's deeper hurt and deeper cry as a human being at the same time? And again, I think this is a great expression of what I would call practical non-duality, right? Like, is this was what it would look like to actually practice non-duality in your relationships. And so for me, I think bringing that together is really important, because oftentimes our methods for acting in the world, like I said, only end up contributing more to the silos that are developing and continuing to grow in our society, rather than finding middle ground, finding ways to stay neighborly with people with whom we disagree. And by that, I do not mean becoming a centrist. I want to make sure that's clear. That's not what I mean, like becoming a political centrist. What I mean is playing a different ballgame altogether, operating in a different register of which is fully non-dual, which again takes seriously our interconnectedness at heart, sees my own mess in the mess of another, rather than wants to just accuse their mess as being worse than my own. You know what I mean? And then kind of coming from that compassionate place of, how can I stay connected in so much as it's in my power to do so, like that verse says. And, so far as it depends on you, try to stay peaceable with everyone, right?
Yeah.
But like, how can I come from that place of connection and recognize, though, I think the other side of this, which I always have to talk about when we talk about this in our community, is if people are being abusive, if people are playing that dualistic game, it's important that you know how to set healthy boundaries for yourself, right? This isn't just self-sacrifice at the expense of your own well-being, right? This is, I actually do want to stay connected. I actually do want to be a force for harmony and for good. And if someone is not playing that game, they want to play the othering game, and it's becoming oppressive, then you have to learn how to set those boundaries. So it's that kind of dance for me. And I hope that relates to your question.
Yeah. No, dude, it totally does. And by all means, keep riffing, because this is good stuff. This is the stuff that I feel like is important, because, and part of the reason why I thought it is important to have you chat with us, because it is a polarizing time. And even with our, small community that meets twice a month, like, people send me emails or direct messages, and they are wanting to know where we stand on this or that or whatever. Yeah. And, I find myself, and I tell them right off the get-go, I'm like, bear with me. This is probably a longer message than what you were hoping for. But, trying to completely, like you're saying, play a different game completely. Yeah. Like, I tell people, like, think of us more like a Buddhist Sangha, than the churches that you've come from. Like, what we're really hoping to do is center around these spiritual practices that transform us from within, that then empower us to be, in trueness of what Paul said, ambassadors of reconciliation everywhere we go. Right. And less, even people say, and you may have a different stance on this. This is my own stance, and I truly mean this. Like, people ask, are you open and affirming? And I always say, I'm open to everyone who's a sincere seeker. I mean, everybody. But affirming, for me, I think I'm trying to help people see, myself or an organization or an institution can't, I'm hoping you're not looking for that affirmation. My hope is that you would affirm yourself wherever you are and you feel like is true within you. You embody that own inner affirmation within you. Now, I know there's a lot of other ways and conversations that we could spark off from that, but the point is that like these conversations that we keep having just keep us going in circles and keep creating others. They keep creating enemies. They keep creating this sense of, can I trust you to be in, or are you over there? Where do I place you in the matrix of my mind and how I experience life? And so my hope is consistently bringing people down to the non-duality of divinity first. There is no affirmation needed when you are in complete oneness with the infinite. And from that place, then you can work as an agent from that infinite, oneness.
Yeah.
Because a lot of my non-dual, and maybe I don't know if you, because I think what you're talking about is practical non-duality. Have you ventured much into, Advaita Vedanta and some of the, the Eastern non-dual schools of, Hindu philosophy or anything like that? Has that been a part of the process?
It was part of the process in grad school. Yeah, I kind of, again, gravitated toward using the language of my home tradition in being able to try to make it relatable and practical, for people in my community. But what's funny about Claremont is the systematic theology professor out there is Baha'i. So you have a very fluid and I would say even trans-religious understanding of non-duality that brings in those other flavors as well. But at the heart of it, and this is this is what I wrote my dissertation on, but essentially, like, for me, like, you could categorize it pretty simply that in the East, it's sort of an I experience of the mystical. The non-duality is an I, and in the West, oftentimes it gets categorized as an I-thou type experience when you have a mystical experience. And for me, I think they're both true. So it's actually the non-dual move is to not go, well, are you more Western in your non-duality or are you more Eastern? But instead, like, maybe they're both articulations of the one, right?
Yeah.
And so I think for me, when we meet that true self within ourselves, it is simultaneously, God and us. You know what I mean? And so, so that's where, philosophically, I would say something like God disappears as an object of your perception and reappears as the subjectivity of your very life, right? Moving through time. And that's trying to bring together both the East and West.
I think that's the quote for this conversation, dude. I love that. I love that so much. So you're doing this work where you are showing people practical non-duality and hopefully inviting people to, not live from a place of reaction, as much.
Yep.
And more of a common understanding of we're all human first and we're all dealing with all of our other shit, that comes along with that.
Sure.
What does that look for you as we begin to close? Like, what does that look for you in this context? And like I mentioned to you before, like all these years later, you're still committed to this work. You're devoted to it. You have a calling to do this. Like, why do you, how does that look like in your life? Why do you continue to be in this lane?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good question. I mentioned at the beginning of my story how, like, just to breathe, just to see the world was to be Christian. And I think growing up in a religious tradition and having a sacred canopy, like I mentioned, you start to wonder at a certain point in your maturation process as you're kind of becoming an adult, was any of that stuff true or was it all bullshit? Like, is any of that spiritual stuff real? Like, is any of that stuff real? And I guess the heart of that question for me is sort of like, what is the value of a wisdom tradition? You know what I mean? Is it something that still has legs for today? And so the edge of curiosity of being somebody who is so shaped by a religious tradition is like, can I keep going? Can I keep going? And I'll say that, like, any good religious tradition sort of has claims about ultimate reality, but even more so about peace. Like, here's how you find a path to peace. In our tradition, my peace I leave you, my peace, I give to you, and so my curiosity has been the whole time to keep going for myself. Can I find that peace? Can I tap into that? And the contemplative stream of Christianity has been just really a gift. It's felt almost like a culmination of those Bible lessons I learned in Sunday school, and I think Richard Rohr, says it most beautifully and succinctly when he says, like, that contemplation teaches us not what to see, but it teaches us how to see what we behold, right? Because he says our initial experience of any moment is always knee-jerk reactions, judgmentalism, cynicism. We're always mistrusting our experience. We're trying to categorize that experience. And he says, the antithesis to that, which I think is the contemplative life, I think this is summative of the whole contemplative endeavor, is instead in that moment, awe and surrender to that awe. Like that's it, right? And so that journey from being so shaped by a religious or a Christian worldview to awe and surrender to that awe, instead of participating in the dualistic mind games of chopping things up and judging everything, creating a story or a narrative around the experience of a given moment that is probably not even corresponding to reality. Instead of that, what if the culmination of the loving way of Jesus is this continued path of continuing to understand what it means to be a peaceful person? And so, since that's been such a gift to me, it's a joy for me to get to do that with other people, and to be able to show them that. And I kind of qualify this statement often by saying, like, hey, if you feel called to leave your religious tradition because you've been hurt, because you've been abused, because you found something else that resonates more, like I met a guy who had been so hurt by Christianity in grad school in my doctoral program that he had left and become a Sufi. So that's a path too, right? There's transfigured paths that don't have to mean you stay. But if you want to use your home tradition, if you want to use your native language, like my definition of religion is that it's a language that we speak and a set of practices that we keep that help us render the world as sacred to ourselves. And if you want to use your home tongue, if you grew up Christian and you want to still speak Christianity because you already know that language, you can. And so part of the work for me that's so beautiful is to help people keep going and go, yeah, you can leave all the, bigoted, ridiculous kind of like ideas behind, and you can keep going and find the heart of love, that was expressed in Christ, that is expressed in Christ in you and I, and you can hopefully keep going and cultivate a contemplative mind so that you can find a path to peace. And that work is sort of infinitely meaningful to me because it feels like home to me, but it also feels like something I can help foster in the world that could be a beautiful story for it to keep living. So I hope that speaks to that. But
dude, it speaks perfectly. It's because I'm with you on that. As we said at the beginning, like I'm a pastor's kid too. We grew up in a very like sister denomination, if you will. I mean, Vineyard was never a denomination. They always were a movement, but we all know that means the same thing. Yeah, right.
They're non-denominational, but
right.
Very specific flavor. Yeah.
And it's like I realized in my own story, it was like as far as I've went into other spaces, religions, traditions, philosophies, whatever, I found left to my natural self, like parables would percolate, and ways of, connecting whatever it was I was learning. I'd be like, oh yeah, that's like what I have already received in some way, and that's been a big call back into this work for myself as well, is to help people see that like there is a really valid spiritual path here that is largely overlooked, baby thrown out with the bathwater. And after I sort of have like come down from not only just deconstruction, but the project that I did for so long of spiritual nomad, of nomading around, it's like I still am curious and open mind and learning and not cut off from anything, but I have reclaimed that sense of learning the native tongue and giving this hopefully a gift back for those that have ears to hear, this sort of refreshed approach to this tradition, Yeah. It's really good. So as we close, can you just tell briefly about the work that you do, like nuts and bolts? Maybe there's somebody in the area. There's a couple people that tune in from Ojai that are like friends with us on social. So maybe they might want to cruise over to Santa Barbara. Like what does it look like to be a part of Way Collective?
Well, I mean, I think at the heart of the community was this idea that if we could gather people around shared practices and values rather than religious beliefs, we have an open and living system, which is to say that, a lot of us come from the Christian tradition, but we have people who are kind of would not probably identify as Christian who come as well. But we all agree that these practices that we have in our community of connection, curiosity, creativity, collaboration, consciousness, and compassionate action are things that they care about, And so for us, when we have, that kind of impetus, I guess, and there's corresponding values with those too, you can't unbelieve your way out of this community, no matter no matter what your background is, and, no matter what creeds you do or don't affirm, there's none of that in there. And so my hope was to do that, but also to kind of stay tethered to the Christian tradition. We do have standing as a Disciples of Christ congregation, but holding that in a way that actually creates the possibility for not only a living system, but for connection for people who may not be able to connect with spiritual community otherwise. So when you come to Way Collective, we just meet weekly for dinner and dialogue, which is literally a meal, for an hour, and then a dialogue, which has like a contemplative pause moment in it. And we have lots of outside Wednesday night activities too. We do reading groups. We have speakers come. We do big events for the wider Santa Barbara community. We have monthly mindfulness gatherings where we facilitate, kind of body work and guided meditation. And we have hangouts. We're celebrating Good Friday and Easter this week because it is Holy Week. So we'll be having, a guided walking meditation at the Stations of the Cross here at the Mission. We'll have on Sunday, I'll send out my Easter meditation reflection days before. And on Sunday, we'll just get together for brunch and an egg hunt and, and some conversation around the meditation and to hold a poetic container for that space. But it's pretty chill. So we do social stuff too. And yeah, so the folks who are around are really cool. I do spiritual direction too. And so there's some of that going on in our community. I'll try to hold space for folks to companion them and mirror back to them the sacred in their lives. And, but yeah, it's been really, really sweet to build this community. And we've been around since 2017, I think, which is pretty crazy.
Yeah.
And, we're really, really small little group of folks, but it's really been meaningful to be together, especially in the midst of these times we're enduring. So,
yeah, man, I love it, dude. I just am so glad for Way Collective, and even whenever I was navigating, you guys were there for me all the way back then. So it's just been such a great time, being friends with you and seeing it all. And anybody that's listening, I encourage you to go and at least follow along on Instagram, even if you're not local to them, because, what Tim's doing is really important stuff. And so I highly recommend to jump on the emails or whatever. Yeah. So thank you, Tim,
we have
for
a podcast too.
Okay. Yeah. Oh yeah. So I did see that.
The teachings are out pretty much. What we call the conversation starters each week are out every week. So, people want to follow along. They're usually only 10 to 15 minutes max. So
that's perfect. So I will, I'll compile a link list below. And so if people want to jump on any of the stuff, it'll all be down there. So should I put your photography Instagram page on? Are you still doing that?
I mean, I'm on it, but I haven't posted in a while, but it's my intent to at some point, but it's just more well,
we're putting it there too. We're just going to throw everything down there. Sure. So yeah, all the links will be below. And Tim, thanks for just a super fun conversation, man. Appreciate you.
Oh, Luke, thanks for having me. It's really good to see you. And next time I'm down in San Clemente, we should meet in Oside or something and hang out.
Indeed, man. Indeed. Thank you.